All right, so today we're diving into some pretty interesting economic stuff. You guys shared two sources that are honestly causing quite a stir. One's all about this Trump session thing and how it connects to potential trade wars, and the other gives us like a Vietnamese perspective on their GDP and inflation in the first quarter of 2025. It's a wild mix of global worries and what's happening locally. So let's unpack it all together.
Yeah, what's really striking is how these two sources are coming from such different places, but they both point to this kind of underlying uncertainty in the global economy. So, on the one hand, you've got financial experts raising all these red flags
Yeah.
about the potential fallout from President Trump's policies, especially with this whole trade war going on. And then on the other hand, you have Vietnam, this country trying to carve its own path in all this global mess. And their economic data is giving us a bit of a mixed picture.
Yeah, that Trump session term really caught my eye. Seems like some economists are seriously worried about a recession, triggered by the trade war and other policy decisions, and you can definitely see those anxieties playing out on Wall Street. I mean, a 4% drop in the NASDAQ and Tesla losing half its value, that's enough to make anyone sweat a little.
Oh, absolutely. And you have to remember the stock market is often seen as this like predictor of future economic expectations. So this Wall Street panic, as dramatic as it sounds, it's really reflecting this deeper concern about where the US economy and by extension the global economy is going. And when you think about the classic definition of a recession, 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, those early 2025 projections for the US dipping into negative territory, well, that's definitely adding fuel to the fire.
Okay, so we've got this potential Trump session looming, and it's spooking investors all over the world.
Yeah.
But how does this connect to what's going on in Vietnam? I mean, they're on the other side of the planet.
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. You might think that Vietnam, being a relatively small economy, would just get swept up in whatever happens globally. But our Vietnamese source tells a different story. They're emphasizing their internal strength and suggesting that they might actually be able to, like, decouple to some extent from the global mess.
Decouple. So they're saying they can kind of do their own thing, even if the rest of the world's heading into a recession. That's a pretty bold statement. What makes them think they can pull that off?
Well, they're pointing to a few things. First, they've been strategically using what economists call monetary and fiscal policies to try to stimulate their economy. Now, don't let those terms scare you. Monetary policy basically means controlling interest rates, and fiscal policy means adjusting government spending and taxes. So Vietnam has been lowering interest rates to encourage businesses to borrow and invest. And they've been increasing government spending on things like infrastructure projects to create jobs and boost demand.
Okay, so they're trying to like pump up their economy from the inside out. But wouldn't that usually lead to inflation? I mean, more money circulating usually means higher prices, right?
That's the balancing act they're trying to pull off. And to their credit, their inflation numbers for the first quarter of 2025 seem to be under control. Now their GDP growth figures aren't finalized yet, but even the most optimistic projections are hovering around 7.5%, which, while it is positive, falls short of the government's target of 8%.
So they're doing okay, but not quite hitting their own goals. I guess that makes sense. Even with their best efforts, they can't completely escape the pull of the global economy, right?
Exactly. It's like they're trying to build a wall to protect themselves from this global economic firestorm. But some sparks are still getting through, and that's where the whole trade war thing becomes really important.
Okay, so trade wars. How is this whole Trump session and the potential for things to escalate even further impacting Vietnam? I mean, they rely so much on exports, don't they?
That's right. And a big chunk of those exports go straight to the U.S. So if the U.S. economy weakens, Vietnam's export industries are going to feel it. And then there's the direct hit from tariffs. Those taxes on imported goods that are at the heart of this whole trade war. If those tariffs keep going up, it could really mess up global supply chains, increase costs for businesses, and ultimately hurt economic growth, both in the U.S. and in countries like Vietnam that are part of those supply chains.
So it's a bit of a no-win situation for Vietnam. They need to trade to grow, but that same trade exposes them to the risks of a global economic slowdown and these trade wars that seem to be getting worse. So what are they doing to deal with those risks? Are they just crossing their fingers and hoping for the best?
Well, they're definitely not just sitting around. In addition to those monetary and fiscal policies we talked about, they're also focused on boosting their domestic consumption, basically trying to make their economy less dependent on exports. And they're making moves to enhance productivity and improve their institutional framework. Those are like long-term strategies aimed at making their economy more competitive and resilient.
So they're playing both offense and defense, trying to stimulate their economy in the short term while also building a stronger foundation for the long term. But is it enough? I mean, can they really decouple from a global recession if it hits hard?
That's the million-dollar question. And to answer it, we need to take a closer look at the specifics of their strategies and the potential risks and rewards they're facing. Let's start by digging a little deeper into this idea of boosting domestic consumption.
Okay, boosting domestic consumption sounds great in theory, but how exactly does Vietnam plan to make that happen? I mean, you need people with money to spend to boost consumption, right?
Exactly, and that's where some of the long-term trends in Vietnam's economy come in. They have a relatively young and growing population, and their middle class has been expanding in recent years. That means more people with disposable income and more potential for domestic spending to drive economic growth.
So they're banking on their own people to keep the economy going, even if things get bad globally. But what about the other side of things, productivity? How are they planning to make their economy more efficient?
That's a key part of their long-term strategy. Think of it this way. If you can produce more goods and services with the same amount of resources, you're basically making your economy more competitive. And that's what Vietnam is aiming for. They're investing in education and training to improve their workforce skills. They're encouraging innovation and technological advancements, and they're streamlining regulations to make it easier for businesses to operate.
So it's about working smarter, not just harder. But what about this institutional framework they mentioned? What does that even mean, and why is it important?
Think of the institutional framework as like the rules of the game for the economy. It includes things like property rights, contract enforcement, transparency, and accountability. A strong institutional framework creates a more stable and predictable environment for businesses, which encourages investment, innovation, and long-term growth. And that's exactly what Vietnam is trying to build. They're working on reforms to reduce corruption, improve the legal system, and strengthen institutions that support a fair and competitive market.
Okay, so they're trying to create a level playing field
Oh.
and a more attractive environment for businesses. But let's be real, even with all these efforts, Vietnam's economic future is still tied to the global economy. How are they dealing with those external risks, especially the potential fallout from the trade war?
That's where things get a bit trickier. They can't control what happens in the U.S. or how the trade war plays out. But they are taking steps to diversify their trading partners and reduce their reliance on any single market, including the U.S. They're actively looking for new trade agreements with other countries and regions, and they're working to strengthen economic ties with their neighbors in Southeast Asia.
So spreading the risk, not putting all their eggs in one basket. Smart move. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. What if the global recession hits hard? Regardless of what happens with the trade war, can Vietnam really decouple from that kind of global downturn?
That's the big question. No country is completely immune to global economic shocks, especially a country like Vietnam that's so integrated into global trade. But their focus on internal strength, combined with their efforts to diversify their economy and reduce their vulnerabilities, could provide some buffer. It's like they're building a life raft. In case the global economic ship starts sinking, will it be enough to keep them afloat? We'll have to wait and see.
Okay, so a lot depends on how bad the global recession actually gets. But let's not forget about the human element here. How are the Vietnamese people themselves responding to all of this? Are they confident? Are they worried?
That's a crucial aspect that often gets overlooked. Public sentiment can really impact economic outcomes. If people are optimistic and confident about the future, they're more likely to spend and invest, which can help boost the economy. But if they're fearful and uncertain, they might hold back, which can actually make an economic downturn even worse.
So psychology plays a role in economics. Who knew? But seriously, what's the mood like in Vietnam?
From what we can tell from our Vietnamese source, there's a sense of cautious optimism. They know there are challenges, but they also seem to believe in their country's resilience and their ability to overcome adversity. I've been through tough times before, and they've come out stronger.
That's encouraging. But even with that cautious optimism, there must be some anxieties. After all, their economic future is somewhat tied to decisions being made on the other side of the world. How does that uncertainty factor into their outlook?
That's where things get a little more complicated. On one hand, they realize they can't control everything. They're at the mercy of global forces to some extent. But on the other hand, there's also this sense of determination, a feeling that they can chart their own course and build a better future for themselves, no matter what happens elsewhere.
So it's a mix of realism and hope. It seems like a pretty good attitude to have in these uncertain times. But let's get back to those global forces we can't control. If this Trump session does happen, how exposed is Vietnam?
That's the million-dollar question. And to answer it, we need to look a bit closer at the different scenarios that could unfold. Let's start by thinking about the worst case scenario, a severe global recession combined with the trade war getting even worse. In that situation, Vietnam would definitely face some serious challenges. Their exports would probably plummet, a foreign investment could dry up, and their currency could weaken, leading to higher inflation. It wouldn't be pretty.
Okay, so a worst-case scenario could really hurt them. But what about something less extreme? What if the recession is mild and the trade war doesn't get completely out of control?
In that case, Vietnam would still feel the impact, but they'd probably be in a better position to handle it. Their focus on internal strength, combined with their diversification efforts, could help reduce the worst effects of the global downturn. They might see slower growth, but they'd probably avoid a full-blown economic crisis.
So their fate really depends on how things play out globally. But regardless of what happens externally, it seems like they're doing everything they can internally to prepare for whatever challenges lie ahead.
Absolutely, and that's a key takeaway here. Even when faced with global uncertainty, proactive action and strategic planning can make a difference. They're not just sitting back and hoping for the best, they're taking concrete steps to strengthen their economy and build a more resilient future.
That's inspiring. It reminds us that we're not completely powerless in the face of these global forces. But I'm curious, what specific policy recommendations would you give to Vietnam's leaders as they navigate these turbulent times?
That's a great question. And it leads us to a discussion of policy options and strategic choices. There are a few key areas where Vietnam could focus its efforts to further reduce risk and become even more resilient. Okay, so I've talked about Vietnam's efforts to, boost domestic consumption, enhance productivity, and strengthen their institutions.
All those things.
What other policy recommendations would you suggest they consider, as they try to navigate this potential global recession and this trade war hanging over everyone's heads?
Yeah, good question.
I think a key area they should really focus on is diversifying their export markets even more.
So not putting all their eggs in one basket, especially when that basket is so tied to the U.S. market.
Exactly. They've made some progress, but they could push it further by, exploring opportunities in emerging markets, particularly in Asia and Africa.
Yeah, that makes sense. Expanding their customer base would definitely make them less vulnerable to downturns in any single market. So what else could they do on the trade front?
Another strategy is to focus on developing those higher value added products and services.
So moving up the value chain instead of just competing on price.
Right now, Vietnam is known for exporting a lot of those low-cost manufactured goods, like textiles and footwear. But if they can develop more, sophisticated products and services in areas like technology, engineering, or even tourism, they'll be less affected by those price swings and global competition.
So basically becoming more specialized and offering something unique that the world wants.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the risks from the trade war itself? If tariffs keep going up, wouldn't that hurt Vietnam no matter how diversified they are?
That's true, and that's why it's so important for them to be proactive in advocating for free and fair trade.
So working with other countries to try to, de-escalate the trade war and promote a more stable global trading system.
Exactly. They can do this through, multilateral organizations like the World Trade Organization, or by forming regional trade alliances with countries that share their interests.
So using diplomacy and collaboration to try to counter those protectionist trends that are driving the trade war.
Right, and it's not just about protecting their own interests, it's also about promoting a global economic system that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
Okay, so we've talked about diversifying export markets, developing higher value added products, and advocating for free trade. Any other policy recommendations you would suggest?
One area that often gets overlooked is the importance of investing in human capital.
So investing in their people through education, training, and healthcare.
Exactly. A well-educated and healthy workforce is essential for any economy, but it's especially crucial for a country like Vietnam that's trying to move up the value chain and compete globally.
So it's not just about building factories and infrastructure. It's about investing in the people who will drive that innovation and growth.
Precisely. And it's about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
That's a really good point. It's not just about economic growth for its own sake. It's about creating a better future for all Vietnamese citizens. So it sounds like Vietnam has a lot on its plate. They're trying to boost domestic consumption, enhance productivity, strengthen institutions, diversify trade, and invest in their people, all while dealing with a potential global recession and a trade war. Do you think they can pull it off?
It's definitely a challenge, But based on their track record, their recent policies, and the resilience of their people, I wouldn't bet against them.
Cautious optimism. I like it. Seems like a good attitude to have when you're facing so much uncertainty.
Yeah.
But let's be real. Even if Vietnam does everything right, their economic future is still somewhat tied to decisions being made in Washington, D.C. and other global capitals.
Yeah, that's the reality of living in an interconnected world. No country is an island, and we're all affected by events that happen far away.
Which brings us back to you, dear listener. So what can you do to make sense of this complex global economic landscape? And you know its potential impact on your own life.
The first step is to stay informed. Pay attention to the news, read articles, and listen to podcasts like this one to keep up with what's happening and understand the forces at play.
So knowledge is power. But what can you do with that knowledge? How can you actually use it in your own life?
Well, once you're informed, you can start making more informed decisions. Think about your own spending habits, your savings goals, and your investment strategy. Are you prepared for a potential economic downturn? Are you diversifying your assets? Are you taking steps to protect yourself financially?
So it's about taking personal responsibility for your own financial future,
Yeah.
even when things are uncertain globally.
Exactly, and it's about making smart choices that align with your values and your long-term goals.
Great advice. But beyond our personal finances, what can we do as individuals to promote a more stable and equitable global economic system?
That's where our role as citizens comes in. We can engage in informed discussions, advocate for policies that support sustainable growth and fair trade, and hold our leaders accountable for their decisions.
So basically, use our voices and our votes to shape a better future for ourselves and for the world.
Exactly, we may not have all the answers, but we can all contribute to the conversation and work towards solutions that benefit everyone.
Well said. It seems like we've come full circle. We started by exploring the potential risks of a global recession and a trade war, and we ended up talking about the importance of individual action and collective responsibility.
And I think that's a good way to wrap things up. We may not be able to control everything that happens in the world, but we can control how we respond to it. We can choose to be informed, proactive, and engaged.
And we can choose to work together to build a more just and prosperous world for all.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive. We covered a lot today, from Wall Street's anxieties to Vietnam's aspirations. We explored some complex economic ideas, debated policy options, and hopefully got some interesting conversations started.
And we learned that even in a world full of uncertainty, there's always room for hope, resilience, and the power of human ingenuity.
Beautifully said. So until next time, dear listener, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
And remember, the world is full of fascinating stories waiting to be uncovered. All you have to do is ask the right questions and look for the answers.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time.